everyone. My name is Rebecca, and I am a software engineer at Blue Metal, and I have been using Redux with my Angular apps over there. You can find me on Twitter at BorisonR, and hopefully in the next few minutes I will explain or show why Redux is not just for React and can be really helpful for Angular apps as well. Okay. So for starters, what exactly is Redux? According to their website, Redux is a predictable state container for JavaScript apps. And we'll go in a little bit more detail into what state is in a second. But essentially, it's an evolution from Flux, which was also a way to maintain and contain your state. And the point of both Flux and Redux is to store an app's entire state in one location, so you can have one single source of truth that is unchangeable, and that at any given point in time, you can go there and see what's going on in your app and what is happening, what the user is looking at that point. Both Flux and Redux were initially created with React in mind, but they can both be paired with Angular and any front-end framework really as well. So just to contrast the two a little bit, Flux was created by Facebook in 2014. Focuses a little bit more on having multiple stores and a dispatcher. Again, we'll go into those terms in a little bit. It's more of a pattern, really, than a framework. Redux was created by Dan Abramov in 2015, and it focuses on having one store with multiple reducers. It's an incredibly lightweight implementation, and you really could implement it on your own if you wanted to, but to save yourself some time, get some help from Dan, you could just import it. So I keep mentioning this state containing and why you would want to do that in your Angular apps. So just to make sure everyone's on the same page, when I say state, this is the Wikipedia definition. So a computer program stores data in variables, which represent storage locations in the computer's memory. The contents of these memory locations at any given point in the program's execution is called the program's state. So let's say you have an online bookstore, and you have a user in Kentucky that opens the website and clicks on a book. So at that point, the state will reflect that that user in Kentucky is looking at your app and that they're looking at that specific book. If they were to look at another book, that would be reflected in the state. If they were to log out and log in as another account, same thing. So why do we need Redux at all? One of the things that Redux is really into is having this one-way data flow, which means that your app will be more organized, less scattered, and it'll help you avoid side effects. When you're using Redux, you're going to be creating these pure functions, which we'll go into in a little bit, and maintaining immutable data. And you will know exactly what will happen as a result of calling any method and avoid any unintended consequences. And this drastically reduces the probability of introducing any bugs caused by cascading data changes. So before we go any further, I just want to take a quick pit stop and make sure everyone's on the same page with observables, because both Angular 2 Plus and Redux love observables. They're essentially an evolution from promises, which were an evolution from callbacks, and they are a way to create constant data flow to subscribers. And the way that looks is if you look at a promise, so it'll say, go get me some data asynchronously. When that's done, I'm going to do this with that data. Observables, on the other hand, will say, go get me some data asynchronously, and as that data comes in, we're going to continuously do something with that data. So every time new data comes to the subscription, we'll console log, woohoo, we have data, and that new result. And a classic example of observables is when you click a mouse, when a user clicks a mouse. So if you set up an observable that takes in data from those mouse clicks, and then you set up a subscription to that observable, every time the user clicks, the data will arrive in your subscription. One more quick pit stop before we get into the gritty details of Redux. I've mentioned Immutable. One of the biggest principles of Redux is making sure that your state is immutable or unchangeable. That way that you can be super clear on what the outcomes are. You can know what to expect, avoid any sort of inconsistencies. And it helps you maintain a read-only state, which is important for really those making sure that your app is organized and you know what's going on. Native JavaScript objects are inherently mutable. So to remain true to Redux principles of immutability, you can import a library like Immutable.js which gives you immutable objects like maps. Or you can also use built-in methods like object.assign or .concat to fudge immutability on your own without importing a whole other library. For the sake of today, I'm going to use Immutable.js just because I think it works really well. Now, let's actually get into what Redux is built of. So the three main components of Redux are stores, actions, and reducers. So an action is really just a JavaScript object that has a type and a payload. Those actions get dispatched to reducers. The reducers then decide what to do with those actions. And those reducers are made up of pure functions, like I mentioned before. So you will know what the outcome will be. There are no side effects. And those reducers then translate the information that comes in from the actions to the stores. To the store. The store updates the view and what the user is looking at. So a reducer, just to go into a little bit more detail, it iterates over a collection of items to get a final result out of it. So think of the array method reduce and how that operates on an array. Like I mentioned, it's a pure function. And to see how those actually work in tandem. So this diagram I found online from Andre Staltz. And you can see the user clicks on the mouse, which then sends an action to the store. It can go through middleware. We're not really going to talk about that so much, but the action will go through the middleware and then hit the reducers, which then update the state in the store, and then in turn updates the view and the screen that the user is looking at. And as you can see, the data is always flowing in one direction so that you know what's going to happen at any given point in time, and it keeps everything organized, not messy, happy, great. Just a really brute diagram that I put together of two-way data flow. So without Redux, you're likely to have two-way data flow in your app if you're not using any other implementation. And this means that you have things going in both directions from the user to the model and back from the model to the user at the same time. And so you might not be sure what's happening at any given point in time. And there may be some unpredictable outcomes of this two-way data flow. So to go back to this lovely unilateral flow, this excellent image comes from Unicravitz. And as you can see, it tells the story of some man named Mark who's proposing, and this woman says yes. So that sends an action to the reducer, aka the Robin, who then tells the tree, and the tree updates the overall knowledge of this couple's engagement. So now we know that they're engaged. Congratulations. So to see how this would actually look in some code, first things first, you're going to want to install, and like I said, you could technically implement Redux on your own, but to save some time and gain some additional functionality and features, I'm going to go ahead and use ngrx, which is a really helpful implementation of Redux for Angular apps. And you're going to want to at least install the core library and the store library. I'm going to be using version 2. They do have a version 4 out there if you're interested in checking it out. But yeah, so once you install the library, I'm going to use TypeScript, keep things nice and safe, organized. And I'm also, as I said before, going to use Immutable.js. And so first thing, I'm going to build my interface of my state. Super simple state, obviously oversimplistic, but we're just going to go with this story here and say that it has one property it's keeping track of, whether or not this couple is engaged, which is going to be a Boolean. And my state is going to extend the Immutable.js map. So now I'm going to set up my reducers. Again, overly simplistic. You, in most cases, would have multiple cases in your switch statement. But here, let's say, if a action comes into my reducer, you're going to check the type and say if the type matches this she said yes, constant, string, whatever, we're going to call this method and set the isEngaged property on our state. If nothing changes, the default is always to return the previous state. Okay. Then you're going to want to create your store in your app module. And all that really entails is importing store module from ngrx, importing our reducer, and putting it right there in our ng module. And again, There are some other cool things that you can do if you look into it. You can put in some middleware. We'll talk in a little bit about also injecting dev tools there. But basic store, this is all you got to do. OK, so now let's actually use it in our app component. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to inject our store in our constructor for our app component. And I'm using here my interface for the app state to keep my TypeScript happy. In my ng-on-init function, I'm going to select the proposal reducer store. This is the language of ngrx. And then I'm going to subscribe to my store so that every time something updates in my store, it's going to hit inside. Oh, here I can put. It's going to hit inside here and update the did she say yes property in my app component to the isEngaged property in my state. And presumably you'll have that bound to something in your view, updating some lovely image or something. You'll also maybe have a button that says when you click it, we're going to call this respond method, see if I can get there, which will dispatch an action to the reducers, to the store. In reality, you'd probably want to put this in a service of some sort. But for now, we're just going to leave it here. And as you can see, the action has a type, she said yes, which matches what we did in the switch statement. And the payload will be the response, which in our case is going to be true because she said yes. Let's get back in here. Cool. So now that's essentially, we just built our Angular-Redux app. Yay. I've been using ngrx as an implementation. There are some other options out there. One of the main ones is angular-redux. ngrx is a Redux-inspired architecture that is heavily observables-based, while Angular-Redux is essentially just a wrapper that uses Redux itself as a dependency and adds some Angular helpers in there. I also think that ngrx is a little bit more well-maintained on GitHub with some more documentation and also some features like effects to help you handle asynchronous calls. But both work perfectly fine. And so there are some exciting bonus perks that you get with Redux in general and ngrx in specific. One of the main things that is great about Redux is that you get this time travel debugging live code editing capability. So as I mentioned before, when you're setting up your Redux store in your app module, you could also inject some middleware in there. So if you wanted to, you could inject this DevTools middleware in there that would grab your state from the store and save previous states when you change the state so that you can easily travel through time and go back to previous states and forward if you want. And this is super helpful for debugging, especially if you're dealing with something like forms. So instead of having to fill it out a million times to figure out where something is going wrong, you can just click through and go back in time and go back forwards. And to see a quick demo of this, and you're gonna have to install a Chrome extension too. There's a Redux DevTools extension. Super easy. So right, so then let's say we have this to-do app here, right? We have our initial state. Let's go to our state with one to-do. You can see it right there. I don't know if everyone can see this, but so let's just add a state quickly. So AngularNYC. Cool. So now you see I called this add to do action, which added a to do here. And let's say we want to complete this. Great. So that sent this complete to do action. But now what's really cool is we can jump back and forth. So if we want to jump back to here, it's not completed anymore. If we want to jump back here, we can. If we want to skip this state, now we're back to the beginning. You can unskip it too. And you can just go back and forth really easily, which is super convenient for debugging. Let's go back here. That also lends itself really easily to undo, redo functionality for the user. So as you can imagine, you can easily implement that so that the user can do that with an undo button and say, oh, actually, I want to go back to the previous state. And all that really entails is, again, adding some middleware to save the previous state when you change it to a new one. On top of those bonus perks, Redux also lends itself to really easy testing, particularly because the reducers are essentially just pure functions. So all you have to do is just call them and make sure the outcome is what you expect. You don't really need any mocking or spies, and you can use whichever framework you want, whether that's Jasmine, Jest, anything. Super easy there. And yeah, that's, hopefully I've explained a little bit why Redux is relevant for Angular and how to get started if you're interested. Some further reading for you all, and I can link to this in the meetup. So this first article here is an interesting walkthrough of Redux's complexity, even though it may look a little bit simple at first. The second one there is talks about using Redux for UI handling, things like modals and sidebars, which can make life really easy in a large code base. And then you have a tutorial there if you want to go through, and some documentation on ngrx. And I hope this was informative, and happy to answer any questions.